Behind the elegant exterior of southern mansions with their gleaming white columns and manicured gardens lies one of the most deliberately hidden truths in American history. For over 150 years, this story has been systematically erased from textbooks, documentaries, and popular narratives about slavery. Academic institutions, publishers, and cultural gatekeepers have conspired to bury evidence that would fundamentally alter our understanding of who participated in slavery's worst atrocities. Most people know slavery in America through carefully curated stories of brutal white male overseers wielding whips over cotton fields. History books focus exclusively on angry plantation owners buying and selling human beings like livestock at crowded slave markets. These narratives, while accurate, represent only half the truth. There is another story, one that shatters everything we thought we knew about power, gender, and control in the antebellum South. The most shocking revelation is that some of the most vicious, calculating, and sadistic slave owners were not even men at all. The very women who society praised as paragons of virtue, gentleness, and moral purity were actually orchestrating some of the most horrific abuses in American history. These same women weaponized their supposed weakness and vulnerability against the very people they claimed ownership over, creating a reign of terror that was often more brutal and psychologically damaging than anything their male counterparts inflicted. In today's video, we are going to show you of the most uncomfortable truths about American slavery, a truth that exposes how the intersection of race, gender, and power created a system of abuse that went far beyond what most people realize. Is this another story about historical cruelty? No. This is an investigation into how ordinary women became monsters, how society deliberately trained them for brutality, and how their crimes have been systematically covered up for over a century and a half. This is the story of how white women in the planter class did not just benefit passively from slavery's profits. They actively participated in its worst excesses, shaped its most dehumanizing practices, and in many documented cases, made it even more psychologically and physically brutal than their male counterparts. But how did these women learn to torture? How did they profit from human misery? And how did they use their gender as both shield and weapon in a system designed to extract maximum suffering from enslaved people? Let's find out. To understand this hidden history, we need to examine the antebellum period. These were crucial years before the Civil War, when American society was rapidly changing and the moral contradictions of slavery were becoming impossible to ignore. The word antebellum literally means before the war in Latin, referring to the period from roughly 1815 to 1861, when tensions over slavery were building toward their inevitable explosion. It was an era of tremendous technological innovation, westward expansion, and economic growth, yet it was also when slavery became more entrenched, more systematized, and more brutal than ever before. The cotton gin had revolutionized agriculture, making slave labor incredibly profitable. Railroads and steamboats had created new markets for slave-produced goods. Most disturbingly, an entire intellectual and social apparatus had developed to justify and perpetuate human bondage. During this time, Southern society deliberately engineered a horrifying system where white girls learned to exercise absolute power over other human beings as part of their basic education. It was not accidental or incidental, it was methodical preparation for a lifetime of dominance. Court records document the shocking reality. 9-month-old babies received other human beings as gifts. Not toys or pets, but actual people who would belong to them for life. Infants received enslaved people as birthday presents, Christmas gifts, and christening presents as casually as modern children receive stuffed animals. The practice was so normalized that families would announce these gifts in local newspapers alongside other birth announcements. Wealthy relatives competed to give the most valuable enslaved people to newborns. Some families even established trust funds managed through enslaved people, ensuring their daughters would have human property to inherit as they came of age. These children grew up never knowing a world where they did not own other people. They learned to give orders before they could properly speak. They absorbed the twisted lesson that their comfort, convenience, and desires mattered infinitely more than another person's life, freedom, or dignity. By adulthood, wielding absolute power over human beings felt as natural as breathing. They had been programmed from infancy to see enslaved people not as humans with thoughts, feelings, and families, but as tools to be used, commodities to be traded, and objects to be disposed of at will. Dr. Stephanie Jones Rogers, a history professor at UC Berkeley, spent years studying this phenomenon for her groundbreaking book, They Were Her Property. Her research revealed that white women made up about 40% of all slave owners in parts of the 1850 and 1860. That was nearly half of all slave owners. Her findings completely overturned decades of historical scholarship that portrayed white women as passive beneficiaries of slavery rather than active participants. Working with previously ignored sources, particularly interviews with formerly enslaved people conducted in the 1930s, Jones Rogers uncovered a pattern of female involvement in slavery that historians had either missed or deliberately overlooked. These interviews, conducted as part of the Federal Writers Project during the Great Depression, contained thousands of first-hand accounts from people who had lived through slavery and could describe exactly how it functioned on a daily basis. The education of white girls included explicit instruction in slave management and violence. They learned how to calculate the value of enslaved people based on age, health, skills, and market conditions. They studied how to assess productivity and identify signs of resistance or illness. Most disturbingly, they received hands-on training in maintaining discipline through brutal punishments. Parents actively encouraged their daughters to participate in beatings from a young age, teaching them that violence was not only acceptable, but necessary for maintaining control. Young white girls would practice giving orders to enslaved children, learning to modulate their voices to convey absolute authority. They were taught to recognize the slightest signs of defiance or reluctance in enslaved people and to respond immediately with punishment. Some families even kept detailed records of punishments administered by their daughters, treating cruelty as a skill to be measured and improved upon. One formerly enslaved person told interviewers in the 1930 TA, "It did not matter whether the child was large or small. They always beat you till the blood ran down." It was a systematic training in the art of human domination. Religious instruction reinforced these lessons in ways that were particularly insidious. White children were taught that slavery was divinely ordained, that God had created different races with different capabilities and destinies. They learned that enslaved people were better off under white supervision than they would be if free, and that harsh treatment was sometimes necessary for their spiritual and moral development. This religious justification provided a framework for understanding cruelty as Christian duty. Church sermons regularly reinforced these messages, with ministers citing carefully selected biblical passages to justify slavery and the absolute authority of masters over enslaved people. White children grew up believing that showing mercy to enslaved people was actually a form of spiritual weakness that defied God's natural order. They were taught that kindness could lead enslaved people astray, and that firm, sometimes harsh discipline was the most loving thing they could provide. Parents deliberately gave their daughters more enslaved people than land, because owning humans made a young woman a more attractive marriage prospect. A woman's worth in Southern society was literally measured by how many people she owned. Marriage negotiations mostly centered around the number and value of enslaved people each party would bring to the union. Some families created detailed inventories of their daughters' human property, complete with descriptions of skills, health conditions, and estimated market values. For these families, slavery was the foundation of their daughters' social status and future prosperity. Young women understood that their ability to attract wealthy husbands depended largely on the size and quality of their enslaved workforce. This created powerful incentives for them to become skilled in slave management and to view enslaved people primarily as assets to be maximized rather than humans to be treated with dignity. White women's participation in slavery was driven by sophisticated economic calculations that went far beyond simple profit-seeking. In the antebellum South, women could not vote, could not hold political office, could not enter most professions, and when they married, Their property legally belonged to their husbands. But there was one significant exception. They could buy, sell, and own enslaved people, just like white men could. For many women, this was their primary source of economic power and independence in a society that otherwise severely constrained their options. The legal framework surrounding slave ownership by women was complex and carefully constructed to protect their interests. Many women hired lawyers to create elaborate trusts and contracts that would preserve their ownership of enslaved people even after marriage. They fought legal battles to maintain control over their human property, often successfully arguing that their enslaved people should remain under their direct management rather than their husband's control. Enslaved people represented multiple streams of value that intelligent white women learned to exploit systematically. Their labor generated daily income through agricultural work, domestic service, or skilled trades like carpentry, blacksmithing, or seamstressing. They could be rented out to other families, businesses, or government projects for additional profit. They could be sold for capital when cash was needed for investments or emergencies. Most cruelly, they produced children who would also become valuable property, creating a self-perpetuating system of wealth generation through forced human reproduction. White women became skilled at maximizing all of these revenue streams through careful planning and ruthless decision-making. They calculated optimal times to sell enslaved people based on market conditions, seasonal demand, age, and health status. They invested in training enslaved people in valuable skills that would increase their market value and rental rates. They carefully managed forced breeding programs to ensure a steady supply of new workers, often keeping detailed records of pregnancy cycles and birth rates among their female slaves. Martha Washington provides a perfect example. When she married George Washington in 1759, she brought 84 enslaved people to Mount Vernon, nearly 5 times more than George's 18. This was not unusual among wealthy women, who often brought dozens or hundreds of enslaved people as their dowry. The domestic slave trade was particularly profitable for women in the Upper South. As cotton production expanded in the Deep South, there was enormous demand for enslaved workers. Women in Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina often specialized in raising enslaved people specifically for sale, treating human reproduction as a commercial enterprise. This trade was brutal in its efficiency. White women would separate enslaved families without hesitation if it meant better profits. They would sell children away from their parents, husbands away from wives, and parents away from their children, viewing the emotional devastation as an acceptable cost of doing business. White women also created specialized markets within the slave trade. They placed thousands of advertisements seeking enslaved women who had recently given birth to serve as wet nurses for their own children. This created a horrific market where enslaved mothers were separated from their babies to feed white infants. The reasoning reveals the callousness of these women. Some complained that breastfeeding their own children made them feel like slaves to their children. They preferred to force enslaved women to do this work so they could maintain their social activities and personal freedom. Some white women even planned the timing of enslaved women's pregnancies through forced sexual encounters to ensure a steady supply of wet nurses. Financial records show that white women mostly managed these economic activities independently of their husbands. They kept detailed accounts, negotiated contracts, corresponded with slave traders, and made investment decisions about when to buy and sell human beings. This economic involvement gave them significant power within their households and communities, creating strong incentives to be ruthless in their treatment of enslaved people. However, the most disturbing and least understood aspect of white women's participation in slavery was their role in sexual exploitation and physical violence. This topic has been largely ignored by historians, partly because it challenges comfortable assumptions about gender, power, and victimization. White women in the antebellum South were oppressed in many ways as they had limited legal rights, restricted mobility, and were expected to be submissive to their husbands. But when it came to enslaved people, these same women held absolute power. They could command, punish, reward, or destroy lives with almost no oversight or accountability. Evidence shows that white women sexually exploited enslaved people, particularly men, in ways that were just as predatory as the more documented abuse by white men. Historical records, including divorce proceedings and court cases, document numerous instances of white women forcing enslaved men into sexual relationships through coercion, threats, and outright rape. Thomas Foster, a scholar who has researched this topic extensively, found that enslaved black men regularly suffered sexual exploitation by white women. It took many forms like physical assault, forced reproduction, sexual coercion and manipulation, and psychological abuse designed to humiliate and dehumanize. Captain Richard J. Hinton, an abolitionist who interviewed many formerly enslaved people, reported that sexual abuse by white women was disturbingly common. He stated, "I have never found a bright-looking colored man whose confidence I have won, who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled, either by his mistress or by white women of the same class, to have connection with them." Light-skinned enslaved men were particularly vulnerable to this exploitation. Their mixed-race heritage, often the result of previous sexual assaults, made them objects of particular fascination for white women who fetishized their appearance while simultaneously asserting racial dominance over them. White women also used the threat of false accusations to control enslaved men. They could claim that a man had attempted to assault them, knowing that such an accusation would likely result in lynching or other deadly punishment. This weaponization of white female vulnerability became a tool of incredible power and cruelty. The physical violence inflicted by white women was often as brutal as anything perpetrated by white men. Court records and slave narratives document countless instances of white women whipping, beating, torturing, and murdering the people they owned. What made this violence particularly tricky was how it was hidden behind the facade of feminine gentility. One of the most documented and horrifying examples of white female brutality was Marie Delphine LaLaurie, a wealthy New Orleans socialite whose crimes shocked even a society accustomed to slavery's violence. Born in 1787 to a prominent Creole family, LaLaurie lived what appeared to be a normal, privileged life. She was beloved in New Orleans high society as a kind, gentle, and courteous figure who attended elegant social gatherings and presented herself as a paragon of Christian virtue. LaLaurie had married 3 times and had 5 children whom she was said to treat lovingly. Her social standing was perfect. Her family included a former Spanish governor and a mayor of New Orleans. In public, she appeared generally polite to black people and even emancipated 2 of her slaves according to court records. Nothing in her background suggested the monster she would become. But behind the show of respectability, LaLaurie was conducting a reign of terror at her mansion at 1140 Royal Street in the French Quarter. Rumors had circulated about her treatment of slaves, including reports of a 12-year-old girl named Leah who fell to her death from the roof while trying to escape LaLaurie's whip. When authorities investigated, they found Lee's body hidden in a well and fined LaLaurie $300, forcing her to forfeit 9 slaves. However, the slaves were secretly bought back through relatives and returned to her control.